Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, a possible solution as to what causes lupus, the cow flu pandemic, or more accurately avian influenza infecting cows, continues to provide us with all kinds of entertainment. A magnesium oil is taken down by science-based medicine, GM broccoli and cancer, another genetically modified crop but improving photosynthesis, a whale discovered washed up on a beach that has never been seen alive before and may not yet, and trust in technology continues to rise. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with lupus, as it's always lupus until it's not.
I finally have a case of lupus. Flush him with saline, transfuse 4 units type A, and start him on steroids. He'll be back hoodwinking idiots in no time.
And that's because lupus is a great pretender. This is the unofficial name for it because it looks like just about every other condition you can possibly imagine. And that's a problem. It either means it can be lupus or it might not be. And it's really hard to define it because there's no set criteria as such to define lupus, at least not clinically. There is a assessment or criteria in terms of research conditions, but clinically there is no established and generally accepted method of establishing if something is lupus. That's a problem, since lupus is at least somewhat common enough to be a problem anyway. The underlying mechanism by which it occurs is the involvement of helper T cells, and these become overactive, meaning that T cells themselves become overactive, and this is why it's an autoimmune disease. So how exactly do you trigger helper T cells to be overactive, and in turn, how do you stop them from doing so? And this is where the general treatment has been simply to pump someone full of immunosuppressants. Basically stop T cells from working, which, yes, it does work, but it's really not a great option, because you are using a blanket suppression. This does mean that all other parts of the immune system are equally suppressed. The reason they have to do that is that every time lupus breaks out, it gets worse. And the more occurrences there are, the worse things get. The mechanism, let's say proposed to explain lupus, is a receptor called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, which is insufficiently expressed. This means that you get a significant difference in the kind of T helper cells that are made, and as a result, you have a problem. Because this is meant to be more like a seesaw, that is, it should be balanced, with a reasonable amount of each. Now there can be slight swings and dips and rises, but overall, the average should be reasonably level. When you have the aryl hydrocarbon receptor on T cells insufficiently expressed and certainly insufficiently activated, this is where you get the problem. That insufficiency leads to the T cells increasingly and very definitely acting in a way that targets a self, or in more simple words, an autoimmune disease. And this is the problem. To test this idea, they simply took the aryl hydrocarbon receptor activating molecules and put them into the blood of those with lupus, and they more or less added extra weight to the side of the scale or balance. And this literally caused everything to balance out again. Of course, media will overhype this, and certainly the researchers do to some extent, as right now they describe it as, if these effects are durable, this may be a potential cure, which is certainly taking this to an extreme, as this is relatively preliminary, and certainly nowhere near a clinical trial stage. Shifting to something that's definitely having an effect on the world and definitely present without having to go through a clinical trial stage, avian influenza, and the fact it's spread from a cow farm to a poultry farm. And this is just great, as it's now showing interspecies transmission. One of those things we really don't want. The problem with this is that it hasn't just spread from the cow farm to the poultry farm, but it's also infected 5 of the humans who are working in the poultry farm. There is a certain downside to this in 2 ways. The one is that, unfortunately, all the poultry on that farm have had to be culled, which means many dead chickens. The second is, well, as mentioned, the fact it's spreading from cattle to chickens and then humans, which is the sort of cycle we really do not want to see. This brings us to the other news item related to avian influenza, but particularly how the role of cows could lead it to becoming a future pandemic vector. The reason for this is very simple. As already demonstrated with avian influenza, the spread of a disease from something like poultry to cattle and then humans is entirely viable, and demonstrated with great effect at the moment. Second possibility is the spread of disease through milk, or particularly milk, given that that's the product most likely to be consumed raw, and this is because people are stupid and have rose-tinted glasses looking back at the glory days they used to live in, back when people would die from unpasteurized milk. The third is a concern about the anatomy and physiology of the cow, and particularly that inside a cow you find receptors that influenza strains from all kinds of species can use, whether it is humans, birds, pigs, and even others again. And that's a concern, as it means that your average cow can become a melting pot for all kinds of different influenza strains, and that means they can mix and match and become far more pathogenic and certainly much more capable of infecting other species because of that shared exchange, let's say. The fact that multiple viruses can infect a cell at the same time means you can wind up with all sorts of different genes mixed and matched. This is further supported by the fact that the genome of these particular influenza strains is prone to, let's say, developing errors, particularly during viral transcription and viral replication. This means that they can often incorporate random extra things they're just not meant to have, or incorrectly copy DNA or RNA. This leads to all kinds of problems, particularly that it drastically increases the rate of mutation. At least for now, we don't need to necessarily worry about it. Certainly be concerned, but it's not yet a cause for panic. What may be a slight cause for concern is China, but not China in politics, military actions, economics, or anything else, but healthcare, and the idea that they're trying to create a world's first AI hospital that can treat about 3,000 patients a day. In a very liberal sense, this makes a lot of sense. That's because AI, if it's well developed, can provide much of the same, let's say, a functionality as a doctor could. It doesn't really matter what kind of doctor it is, whether it's a specialist or a general practitioner, but either way, they can do much the same. But they are limited in what they can perform at present, and that's simply because AI at the moment isn't able to achieve everything that a regular doctor can, and certainly having a doctor go over the decisions of an AI after the fact would defeat the whole point of having the AI doing this. So it's unlikely that they're going to have a, well, let's call it a overwatch body responsible. They're simply going to let the AI do what it does. Now, the reason they need this weird phenomena is simple. There's a lot of people and not enough doctors, as it takes a long time to train up a doctor. It can be anywhere between 8 and 12 years, or even more again, depending on what the doctor's going to be doing. Whereas, this sort of setup, you can basically build a hospital in somewhere less than 4 years, and within that same time frame, develop your whole setup, your interfaces, your AI, your processes, everything else required. So in somewhere between a third and a quarter of the time required for a student, you have a whole hospital, and effectively the whole staffing requirement. And the downsides to this are, as mentioned, it is, in some respects, handicapped by comparison to a real doctor. The first reason is that these models are still very much learning. The advantages are, though, that the learning of one will be translated and transferred to all the others, but basically a hive mind, if you will. But that does also come with the problem that, well, as Dr. House says, patients lie, and AI really doesn't have the ability to grasp humanity lying to it just yet. And in some respects, that's good news. The final hurdle that this, let's say, proposal faces, although at this stage it's less a proposal and more actually put into practice, is getting the facility and the AI approved, as they would need to adhere to all of the regulatory requirements of any other medical practice. And that's going to be the big hurdle here. Shifting to similar sorts of news, that is a treatment, but this time the treatment that has all sorts of magical claims, yet it doesn't really live up to that expectation. A magnesium oil, or in fact any magnesium product to be true with you. The problem with this entire concept is how topical application is going to affect something inside your body, and particularly if we're talking about a metal, or more accurately described in this context as a mineral, but it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. The problem with this is simple. The skin acts as a very effective barrier. That's why if you rub talc all over your skin, you're not going to get it absorbed into the bloodstream. Similarly, if you go and you apply, say, iron rust, or iron oxide more accurately, to your skin, it'll look reddish coloured or brownish, but it's not actually going to penetrate through the skin. This is why applying magnesium oil, or any other magnesium product for that matter, won't work. The second reason, which is far more significant, is simply that magnesium is abundant in the human body. It's present in bones, tissues, everywhere else, but largely speaking it's stored in the bones. And we get most of what we use from our diet, if not all of it. Although how much that gets used immediately and how much gets stored and pulled out later on is a different matter. In terms of what we consume, about 1/4 to 3/4 of what we consume in terms of magnesium is actually absorbed into the bloodstream and then used. The total amount of magnesium that you need in your body, and this is both tissues and bone, is somewhere between 24 and 25 grams. That means you don't actually need all that much, and especially if we're talking about adding far more. For example, what would be suspended in this oil solution? This brings us to the final problem, and that is you don't need the magnesium, and the topical application of it doesn't work, because you literally cannot absorb it through the skin. And just about every study that's tried to demonstrate this has had major flaws, some so bad that you can almost completely dismiss the study. For example, not having a control group, which is a major problem. One thing magnesium does play a role in, and this is somewhat ironic, is it's a laxative when consumed orally. It will literally cause you to spout shit, admittedly from the other end, but nonetheless, it'll cause you to poop, and poop aggressively. In the same vein, we have a claim from one study that your poop scheduling could say a lot about your health. Now, this is an interesting argument to make, as there is a certain amount of truth to it. For example, if you compare your feces to the Bristol stool chart, it could tell you a little bit about what's happening. It's certainly not a major indicator of your overall health, but it could be useful. This is where the frequency of your trips to the porcelain throne are an indicator of your health, at least according to the study. Pooping once or twice a day is supposed to be an indicator of good long-term health. Anything different from that is a problem. It's either an indication of constipation or diarrhea, and both of these are bad. The study did look at a reasonably large cohort. It's about 1,400 healthy adult volunteers with no signs of a disease. So think of things like diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, autoimmune problems, so on and so forth. They then had the individuals self-report their data, which is a slight concern, particularly when you're asking somebody about how often they go to the toilet. There's a reasonable probability that they may be reporting what's expected to be normal rather than what is normal, but as you can't monitor the individual's trip to the porcelain throne, it's not really an option. So they have a response rate, and they've divided this into 4 groups. The low normal, which is somewhere around 3 to 6 times per week, high normal 1 to 3 times per day, diarrhea, and constipation, which is only once or twice a week. They then also had stool samples, blood samples, the questionnaire results, and the pooping frequency. The reason this study is somewhat more, not necessarily reliable, but certainly more comprehensive, is that they looked in the questionnaire with psychology, diet, stress, exercise and lifestyle, along with clinical results such as glomerular filtration rate, that's the functioning of the kidneys. They looked at gene sequencing of what's in feces, and everything else we mentioned. This is particularly useful as it tells us a lot more about what's going on in the body than just what a questionnaire alone would. What they did find, that is, if you are constipated, the bacteria within the GI tract, and particularly in the feces as it's getting towards the end, run out of their typical candidates to use. That's mostly dietary fiber, which they can produce energy from, and so they start relying on other products, and these other products can cause problems, as those other products lead to the production of various byproducts. Those byproducts can still be absorbed in the latter end of the GI tract, which is an issue. In order to ensure that there's both adequate dietary fiber and that there's not an excess production of these unwanted metabolites, pooping once or twice a day is supposedly the Goldilocks zone. But of course, this is, for all intents and purposes, preliminary research, as it's a fairly limited sample size given that you're trying to extrapolate it out to humanity as a whole. Second, there's a lot of variability in the various variables they were looking at, remembering that that survey covered a lot. Plus you had bacterial sequencing of the genome, you had the various functionality of the body, and you had all kinds of other things that could have affected this, especially when you look at all the possible effects and variables that come into play. One thing they did determine was that, at least in demographics, younger women and those with lower body mass tended to poop less often, and because they pooped less often, they were more prone to these problems. But there's a complication to that claim, and simply put, if you eat less, you will generally weigh less, and therefore, because you're eating less, you will need to poop less. You can see how this might affect the bowel frequency. Younger women also tend to fit into the lower consumption end of things, simply because, well, they have priorities around appearance, not necessarily always, but certainly far more often than their male counterparts would. Shifting to other health-related news, we have the juncture of health, and particularly things like cancer, and the role of agriculture, in the form at least of genetically modified broccoli. Genetically modified broccoli could theoretically be modified to increase its cancer-fighting compounds. Understand that this is a very questionable claim, mostly down to the fact that, typically speaking, most of the products that are responsible for preventing cancer, when consumed in moderation, are fine. They do exactly what you'd expect. The problem is when you consume them to a greater degree. This is, for example, what happens with antioxidants. In small amounts, they keep the oxidizing agents, the radical oxygen species, in check. But once you start consuming them in larger quantities, they actually start causing damage, and can therefore cause exactly the problem you're trying to stop. In this case, the researchers are arguing that by altering production of something called glucosinolates, or GSLs, you could theoretically help improve health, because the GSLs are an anti-cancer product, at least they have properties to that effect. But keep in mind what we said about the issue of excessive consumption of anything that's supposed to be good for you. Next we have what is basically the same thing again, except this time it applies to ultra-processed food. Now it's very important to state that the research itself is looking at exactly that, ultra-processed food. A lot of the media claims and various social media posts have jumped to the conclusion that eating any certain foods, for example red meat, are bad for you, and that it has a direct effect on increasing your risk of diabetes. No. Remembering, ultra-processed food is, for example, things like a lot of the, let's call them meat-type products like hot dogs, certainly salamis to some extent, although less so. You then have things like those ready-to-eat meals, some of the canned foods, and similar. Things that aren't, well, they don't look very much like their original constituent ingredients. And by itself, it's not necessarily wrong, it's certainly not necessarily right either. Remembering, moderation is key to most things in life. It's just the way life is. The second issue with this is how they went about their research. They had a fairly large cohort about 13,000 individuals between 1987 and 1989. They were sent a questionnaire, which is a problem because anytime you send someone a questionnaire, you need to question whether they're going to provide you with answers, and particularly as the questionnaire gets longer. Now this is somewhere in the middle with the 66 items, and it was also semi-quantitative, which is another issue again, because now you start with mixed methods, which does not necessarily make the study weaker, but it does make it a little more difficult to extrapolate it out to other areas in life. The other issue was the analytical method they used, as they were using Cox regression to evaluate the association, which is another problem. All they've been able to establish, if they have established it, is association and not necessarily causation. It is fundamentally the correlation does not equal causation argument. When they tried to adjust for socio-demographics, total energy intake, health behaviors, and clinical factors, things changed somewhat, and importantly so. To somewhat simplify what they found, when they ran their analyses, they found that those who consume sweetened drinks, ultra-processed meats, and sugary snacks had a higher risk of diabetes. Now, the relationship between ultra-processed meats and, well, generally speaking, inferior quality foods, such as soft drinks, soda, pop, whatever you wish to call it, and sugary snacks, is fairly well established. In short, it's, typically speaking, the lower the socioeconomic strata of an individual, the more likely they are to consume these foods, which means, at least in America, they have less access to medical care. They're not low in the socioeconomic status. That means they're poorer, undereducated, and typically not able to afford better quality food, and their health behaviors tend to be worse. So no wonder they have diabetes, if what they have found is accurate and able to be extrapolated out to the rest of society. This brings us to agriculture as a whole, and we're going to look at a particular publication that claims a new method or technique could improve photosynthesis rates, which, at least in theory, is beneficial as it would drastically improve the rate at which your crops could grow. Now, they've used CRISPR to modify the genes in rice to help with this process, and at least in theory again, it would mean that the rice plant would grow taller quicker and, assuming it's seasonally matched, be able to start growing grains and therefore be harvested sooner. But this is a major caveat to it. That if it works as intended, and it does actually benefit, in terms of this study at least, the ability to actually produce the desired grains or other crops if it's applied to other plants. Where this particular approach does differ from other particular studies looking at similar sorts of ideas, that is, how do you improve growth of crops, this looked at altering a regulator, so it's not actually changing the gene responsible directly. Rather, by altering a regulatory gene, it's able to, well, alter the function of the gene that's being regulated, and by increasing its functionality in this case, that's exactly what you get. You get enhanced gene expression and therefore greater photosynthesis activity. Next we have the question as to, well, why did Californian researchers choose to target rice of all possible crops? The answer to that is fairly simple. Unlike, say, corn, wheat, potatoes, and so on, which are all staple crops, rice only has 3 genes that are responsible for photoprotection, and by altering one of these 3 genes, they're able to drastically improve photosynthesis. And that's why rice was chosen. There are fewer target genes that they could alter, and therefore it's much easier to achieve what they wanted. So this probably sounds great, at least in theory, and certainly only in practice applying to rice, except for one major caveat, and this major caveat really does undermine everything else that we've mentioned so far. Only 1% of the plants that they modified had the desired phenotype. 1% is a tiny fraction. In fact, it's practically useless in agriculture as a whole. But it could, at least in theory, be useful if you're able to get those 1% of the plants, take the seeds from them and use them. But that might be a bridge too far. Shifting to other academia-related news, but this time from The Guardian, which is probably the furthest thing from academia, and arguably why the article is what it is. It's an article titled "Academic Journals Are a Lucrative Scam and We're Determined to Change That." Now, the article is not focusing necessarily on the fact that academia is wrong, but rather, there's only a handful of publishers that really control the entirety of the industry. And that's the issue here. You have the 5 companies: Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor & Francis, Springer Nature, and Sage. If you're going to publish your findings, there's a very good chance it's going to be one of these 5, or at least a journal owned by one of these 5, and that's a problem, simply because the prices they charge are exorbitant, but also their profit margins are ridiculous. Understand, a business with a good turnover might expect to see somewhere around 10% in profit margins, and that's not a bad rate at all. Publishers have 40% profit margins. The reason they can achieve such ridiculous profits is very simple. The work that is done is almost entirely done free of charge by volunteers, and that is, academics do the editing, the peer review, the submission work, all of this for free. All the journal as such does is set out a criteria for acceptance and host the content. And yes, there are certainly costs associated with hosting, but certainly not $4, $5, or even more $1,000 worth of costs. The other issue, and it's certainly the other side of this argument, and admittedly something we agree with the Guardian author on, the journals get paid for the content to be hosted, but then they charge for access. Now, you can also pay more for an article to become open access. That is, there are no paywalls, but if you've already taken payment to host it, why are you then charging, regardless of that fact, for access? It would stand to reason that you're basically taking 2 payments for the same thing or double charging. This is especially bad when we talk about the universities that have to pay twice. Universities, as much as it may be painful to say, tend to be fairly strapped for cash. A lot of that money is going into unnecessary administrative nonsense. But it's still there, and it still gets spent, meaning that there's far less available for basic research or applied research. That money gets spent very carefully, and used as best as can be done by the researchers involved, so this is one way that the money gets spent. Then it gets spent again, submitting and paying for the article to be published, and then finally at the end they pay to come back and access that same article that they've already paid for twice before now. And that's the problem. Of course, the article author does have this entire argument laid out for a very different reason than necessarily the good of academia as a whole. Rather, it's so they can sell their own, admittedly a not-for-profit publisher called the Open Library of Humanities. This journal is admittedly going to be charging a cost to publish in it, which is necessary in order to cover the operating costs of any kind of publisher, but it's going to be significantly less, and by that we mean up to a quarter in some cases, of the publishing cost in a, let's say, a top 5 publisher. Admittedly, it's really the only 5 rather than the top 5, but nonetheless. The other concern with it is simply that most individuals who are in academia at some point end up as either a reviewer or, in many cases, an editor for a journal, and that's because there's a certain amount of prestige associated with having your name tied into this. It's essentially being an honorary member of a elite organization. You don't actually have to do anything necessarily, although often they will be, but it also ensures that they have their name out there and can say, I contributed to the wider literature in X, Y, or Z way. And this brings us to what is newer research, and quite literally, it's almost brand new. The 5-meter long whale creature washed up on the shores of New Zealand. The whale creature, as you described it, is properly called a spade-toothed whale, and the reason we call it a whale creature is that there have only been 6 specimens found before now, and just about all of those were so badly worn down, degraded, and effectively destroyed that you couldn't really get much out of them. This one was fresh enough for a dissection to occur, and that's kind of helpful since there's almost nothing known about them. Unfortunately, we also won't know much more for quite a while, as there's a certain amount of, how to put this, hesitancy to actually dissect the creature, and mostly down to the fact that if somebody screws up, they're going to get most of the world's conservationists really angry at them. So they're making very careful decisions as they figure out how to analyze the genetics, how to obtain the necessary genetic material, and how to do the dissection to figure out the anatomy and physiology of said weird whale. And next we have technology-related news, but this brings us back to medicine in a way, although not quite yet. It's a nanorobot that is being powered in an unexpected way. The Japanese researchers are able to empower these tiny nanorobots that are basically motorized using a what could be best described as fundamentally a chariot, using green algae. Yes, they've quite literally managed to attach 2 green algae to this structure, and the green algae move themselves around using their flagella, and by doing so they pull the structure behind it, almost acting like a coach or carriage. The choice of green algae is driven by 2 factors. One is that they can pull something up to 5 times larger than their own size. The second is that they are generally considered safe for human consumption. This brings us to how and why it can be useful. The first and simplest reason is this. The normal approach to this requires some external source of power, and that obviously is something finite and means that they will eventually run out. And that's not good. But because this is a living organism, and importantly a living organism that can effectively source its own food and nutrition, it won't run out of power. Unlike a typical horse-driven carriage though, this horse doesn't need to have the bridle and harness taken off. Instead, it can just remain in it permanently, which is why the weird structure works the way it does. The other thing to this is that said weird structure isn't something difficult to make, at least not in the terms of which you might think. Instead, it's a 3D printed harness. Of course, you would never be able to realistically create this sort of structure, not using your typically available, let's say, consumer level 3D printer. And that's because the harnesses are between 50 and 60 microns in width. Your typical 3D printer, let's say the default nozzle size of 0.4 millimeters, is about 400 microns across. So this is nowhere near enough to be able to make something that's 1/10 that size again. But going down to something like, say, a 0.1 millimeter nozzle, now we're talking about 100 microns, or about twice the width. And theoretically, with an even smaller again nozzle size, you could get here eventually. But it's also worth pointing out that the average human hair is about 100 microns in thickness, so the nozzle internal diameter needs to be smaller than a strand of human hair. The other design elements to this are that they created 2 different versions. Now, we've spoken about the chariot version, which the researchers call the scooter, but there's a second version, and the second version is more like a wheel. It has 4 of the harnesses or baskets, all facing the same direction, meaning that if algae go into it, it will only turn one way, similar to how an animal might be harnessed to turn some sort of grindstone. There is a major caveat to this, and the major caveat is just how much reduction in speed the algae experience once they're harnessed into this. The algae can move at a rate of between 20 and 40 micrometers a second. When they're not harnessed, they can move it up to 100 micrometers a second, though we do see a nominal drop to between 20 and 40% of their nominal maximum speed. The last news item we have for you is an article, or more accurately a blog post from the Neurologica blog, and it's titled Trust in Technology, and it's really quite interesting as it looks at how people perceive the emergence of technology and its applications. The obvious example is going to be something like autonomous vehicles, such as what Tesla is intending to bring out eventually, one day, maybe. But also the previously mentioned article about AI-powered healthcare, and of course all kinds of other applications. An interesting point that the author brings up is the opinion or statements from experts in a given field and how this alters the trust in a given thing. What they found, at least in the article being cited by the author, is that expert opinion, that is basically an authoritative voice, did not modify the, willingness to trust it, but it did modify the impact of trust on risk perception. So basically, although it might be perceived as less risky, people may not trust it any more than they were going to anyway. They also reiterate what should be already well known and understood about the role of media in this. That is, the more astounding, amazing, or click-driving the content or headline is, the more likely the media is to actually use it and post it or publish it. And so they tend to not really rely on nuanced or reasonable statements, instead going straight to what is the most extreme and amazing thing they can think of. Of course, like most rational and reasonable people, we're not insisting that you simply accept authoritative opinions or the expert knowledge. Rather, don't necessarily jump to the idea that something is necessarily negative, and certainly don't carry a bias, either because it's an unknown, it's difficult to understand, or because there is a certain amount of expertise, or certain areas of experts, saying you should trust it. It's worth not necessarily being inherently against something just because it's new and shiny. It's worth being wary of it, but not being against it. More so if it's an emerging field. For example, what happened with COVID-19. The fact is that as more information emerged, opinions, views, and thoughts had to change. And not just because, times changed, but because what we knew changed. And that's the key there. Without knowing enough, or at least operating on only information available at a given time, you then have to wait and then figure out, okay, this is what I thought, this is the new information, how do I then mesh these two together, and does it change the final opinion? And that's what happened frequently, and to people's great chagrin, throughout the early days of COVID-19, when they thought, well, you told us one thing, now you're telling us another thing. Yes, because the information changed. New data, new revision of what you thought, may or may not alter the final decision. And that should be applied to new technology just as much. At the moment, most new technology isn't inherently bad or evil, but it should be taken with skepticism until we know more about how it works, what it does, and certainly how it performs in context of being applied in practice. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.